Hello, welcome back. So now that we've modeled the skull, we're going to apply the skin on top of the skull. But before we do that, I just want to show you something really cool within Zbrush. We can apply models directly on top of our skull just by using a brush. So if I go onto my brushes here and then press C for creature, and this one, chisel creature design, I can actually, let's just move this to the side. I can use these as default models to apply to my design. So if I wanted some spikes here, and I've got my skull selected within the subtool, I can select on the spike and then I can just drag this out. Okay, so you can very easily change your design just by adding these cool little features. So here we've got teeth. I could have done the teeth this way instead of modeling it myself. We've got an eye here, creature's eye. Yeah, so you could have it so the flesh is only just on top of the skull there. So there's some very cool designs that you can experiment with. I already think that looks quite cool. So let's say, for example, you added the eyes and then you wanted some spikes. So you added some little horns here. And then an even bigger one in the back. Okay, so you can just experiment with this and see what cool designs you can come up with. Here we've got nostrils. Very cool. We've got ears. Not bad. Okay. And if you want to scroll across, then you can hold Control, left click and drag if there are any more. Here we've got neck. Let's have a look at this. So I need to select my jaw. Look at that, very cool. So just by using our reference to create the skull, we can come up with something totally different by using these creature designs. You can download custom ones online, so it might be worth checking out some different ones online. We're going to use a separate pack to add all of these small little skin details on top of our model. But I just thought I'd show you that. It's a very cool little feature within Zbrush, and you can totally change your design once you've modeled this skull. Okay, so I'm just going to go right back. If that can't go back there, let's just do a file and open. Don't save, and load my skull back up. And then we're going to model this skin. So we need to create a new model on top. So I'm going to go to Append and append a new sphere. And just in case I didn't mention it in the last video, this is pure ref. Okay, so that's how I get these references here. So I can just double click on my reference and it's instantly going to bring up that reference. It's a very cool piece of software, which is free to download. You can chip in and give them a bit of money if you want to, but it is free to download. So that's pure ref if you want to get this software. Okay, so we've got the sphere on top. I'm just going to change this back. In fact, I'm not on my custom layout, so I'm going to load that. I'm going to go to Preferences, Config, and Load UI. And then I'm going to load my custom UI. Yeah, there we are. Cool. And let's start moving this around. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that move tool and I'm going to make sure my sphere is selected, and I'm just going to scale this in. I don't actually need that much there. I'm also going to scale this outwards, and I'm just basically going to make sure that it's covering the entire model. So I can select this transparent tool just so I can see through, so I can see exactly where this is lining up, and I'm going to rotate this and move this down. So I've got this egg shape directly on top of my skull. Now in this case, we're not going to model two separate pieces for the bottom jaw. We're just going to model the entire thing with this single piece of geometry. So that is lining up. We've got a slight clip through there. Let's just scale this up. That's looking okay. And now we can use this move tool and start to place this over the skull. So let's go to this side view and slowly start to move this down. Now I've just realized that there's no symmetry on, so we need to turn that on. Hold Control, left click and drag, make sure activate symmetry is on. Okay, so again, Control, left click and drag on this little menu if you want to turn that on, or you can go up here and you can turn it on through the transform. You can also just press X on the keyboard to turn it on. Okay, so now that that's got the symmetry, let's try and morph this onto our skull. So I'm still going to be using my reference. I'm just going to get this rough shape first and try and make the overall shape of this skull. Okay, so let's push this back. You can clearly see this is too far forward. So let's bring this down and then just redynamesh as you go along. And then here I'm just holding shift to smooth, just to drop the model back down a little bit. Okay, that's looking cool. There we go. Redynamesh. In fact, is my Dynamesh on? Nope, it's not on. So let's go to resolution 100 and then redynamesh, and there we go. Sometimes it turns itself off. Just make sure it's on. So in this case, I'm going to move this right underneath the jaw, and then we'll extrude this out and we'll create the rest of the body later. Okay, so we're at least going to have the bust modeled for this concept. Okay, that's looking good. So that bumpiness there can be removed just by holding shift, and then that will smooth it out. So bring it up, that's looking okay. And you don't want it to be too close to the bone because there are muscles underneath, so have it so it's slightly away from the bones. So here I'm just pushing it back into the eye socket. Again, I don't want this to clip through into the skull. I remember from my other reference that the brow line here is actually quite straight. So I'm going to try and keep that the same within this skin model. Let's bring it back. We can see it's actually quite far away from the model, so that's okay. And that's already starting to look pretty good. Let's just turn the transparency off. Yeah, it's a pretty good shape already. So we can just start pushing and pulling and making some minor adjustments just based on this reference. So I could go into this side view and I can see, does anything need to be pulled out? Do I need to extrude anything? We can kind of see that here on the eye socket. If I just zoom in, it curves around here, whereas this one doesn't really do that. So I'm just going to go back into my standard brush and add that. And there we go. So here I'm just loosely figuring out where those eyes are going to be, where the nose is going to be. I can use Damien Standard just to cut in. And then I can go back to transparency and just see where that nose is. So the nose hole actually goes quite far back, but the nose here is going to be in line with where that hole is. So I need to try and get that in line, and that actually looks pretty good. If I go back to my perspective, and let's look through. That looks okay, yep. And then we can go back to this standard brush and loosely start sculpting into it again. So as soon as we're confident that we're not going to clip through the model, we can turn off that transparency. Sometimes it kind of gets in the way. You can no longer see what you're modeling, what's underneath and what's on top. So we can see here, there's this line that cuts through. Sometimes it can be a little bit confusing. You think that that's actually on the model on top and not on the one underneath. So you can turn that off and just double check. But in this case, it's quite good because now I can just use that smooth tool and know exactly where I need to place that line. So here I can hold Alt, left click and drag to subtract, and then make that cut line. So I'm going to turn that transparency off just so I can see what I'm working with. And that's looking pretty good. I think here it might be coming out just a little bit too much. So let's just use that move tool again and push this in. Yeah, we had loads of room there. So let's bring that back. That's more like it. Okay, so when we get the basic shape, that's when we then need to start increasing the resolution so we can add more detail. In this case, I'm just going to do a little bit more modeling, try and get this basic shape down in this block-in stage, and then I can start to increase the resolution. So I can see here that eyebrows have really raised, so I'm just going to bring these down slightly. That looks a bit better. Bring this brow down. So you can already start to use that Damien standard and just make that cut lines to where the mouth's going to be. So in this case, it's around about here. I'm going to turn that intensity down to about 10. I'm just very lightly cutting through this. Okay, and then I can use that move tool just to make sure nothing's clipping through. It's going to move these cheekbones in, and then I think that's about it. There we go. That should be the one. Okay, great. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the resolution. So Dynamesh is currently at 104, so I'm going to bump this up to about 180 and then re-Dynamesh. Then it's just a matter of adding more details. So I'm just going to smooth this out. The intensity on the smooth is currently set to 100, so I'm going to set that to maybe about 30. It's a little bit too intense there. Well, it's not changing. 30. That's a bit better. Just notice my Dynamesh has gone back down, so let's change that to let's do 180 maybe. Redynamesh. That's more like it. So always just have this geometry panel open with your Dynamesh just to make sure that it is actually on, and it did work. That's better. I'm going to use that pinch tool. The nostrils are a little bit too wide, so let's make them a little bit thinner. That's better. And sometimes it's best to just move to a different reference. So I can see from here, it looks like the nose area is really dipped in, whereas on this one, not so much. So when I go back into this side view, I might just want to use that inflate tool just to bring it back out. I could use the snake hook or move tool just to push it out this way. I'm going to try the inflate and see what that does. That's not too bad. Inflate again, redynamesh. That looks a little bit more like it. And then use that move tool just to pull this back in. So I'm going to use that Damien standard and cut through here. Just to further emphasize that ridge in the eyebrow. So anywhere where it's clipping through, just use that move tool and bring it back. And if you suspect that maybe the skull that's underneath wasn't in the right proportion, then you can always just go back to subtool and just turn those skulls off with the eye tool there, and then continue sculpting. So there I just used that Damien standard. I held Alt to then add instead of subtract. And then you can hold left click to subtract that area. So we are actually going to model these eyes separately. For now, I just want to get some sort of placeholder to think exactly where these are going to be. And it's starting to take shape now, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's just experiment by using this snake hook tool and pushing and pulling this cheekbone here. I don't know if that actually looks right, so I'm going to go into a side view. I think I got a side view here. There we go. And let's have a look at this one. So here we can actually see that this section should be moved back. So I'm going to go to move, and I'm going to pull this out slightly. And then I'm going to push this in. So keep going back to the front and side view just to make sure you're not making any kind of major changes. And that's looking okay. Let's move this in slightly. Go back to that side view. It's actually quite flat there, isn't it? So let's try and get that down a bit. There we go. That's a bit better. Excellent. Yeah, it's taking shape now. So I'm going to go back onto that Damien standard and hold Alt to add to the model. There we go. And then same here, up to the nose. So Damien standard's great because it's going to have that harsh, very straight line. But then you can hold Shift and Smooth just to smooth that out. So let's go back to a different reference. This one's a 3D model. This one's a front view with a bit more perspective there. And let's go back to this one. Okay, so we can see here, it's a little bit thicker than what I've got here. It's quite thin. So I'll need to change that. Let's go back to this move tool. Oh, it's just saving. So Zbrush by default does save the file in a quick save folder. So you'll have quite a lot of saves. At the same time, that does take up quite a lot of space. So keep that in mind. You might need to go back into it. If I go back to Lightbox Tools and you go to Quick Save, here's everything that was saved recently. So there's quite a lot in there. I would need to delete this. It does take up quite a bit of space. Right, let's hide that and let's continue. So let's move this move tool and let's push this out slightly. Yeah, that looks about right. And then back to Damien standard and then cut into it. That's a bit better. So I'm just trying to emphasize that cheekbone there. This kind of moves around and goes back into the mouth area, as we can see here. So I'm just trying to do something similar just by using Damien standard. So also think about where you're going to add the fur. If you're going to add fur, let's say predominantly on the top, we're not going to add loads of detail on the top here. I will add some sculpted details, but I'm not going to add too much detail. There will be quite a lot of fur on top, so there's no need to sculpt it. So think about how long it's going to take for you to sculpt this. If you're under time constraints, then just think about what you actually need to sculpt within that scene. It's looking very happy at the moment. I don't really think that was the vibe I was going for, so I think I might just make this look slightly angrier, or at least a little bit more of a kind of neutral look to it. Right, so for the ears, I'm just going to move this down to the side. The ears are around about here on this model. So I'm going to use the same technique as I used to pull out the cheekbone. I'm going to use the mask, so hold Control and left click on the keyboard to create the mask. Okay, and you can always change the position of it just by undoing the mask and then redoing it. I think that looks just about okay. Let's just go to a different reference just in case. Yep, that looks about right. So we're now going to hold Control and then left click away from the model to invert it. And you can either use the move tool and just move this out, or you can use the move. So move brush, or actually use move, and then just scale this up. And then just deselect and also redynamesh. We can go back to draw and then just smooth this out. And then we'll need to use that move tool again, just so we can create the right shape. We don't want these to look like horns, so let's just make this a little bit thinner and then round this off. Looks like two marshmallows sticking out of his head. We definitely don't want that, so we're going to need to try and push this down. Whoops. Okay, so I'm just making these small adjustments. We also don't want these to look like Mickey ears, so I'm going to make these just a little bit smaller, bring these out. It's this little edge here. I need to just keep smoothing this. Let's set the intensity a bit higher. That's a bit better. That's the one. Back to move tool. Let's move this up. And then we can go into Damien Standard and just very quickly start to sculpt into this. So I'm just going to turn that skull off. I feel like maybe the original skull, that's a bit better. The cheekbones might have been sticking out just a little bit too much, so I'm just going to move this down. That looks better. There we go. Right, so now that we've got to this stage, I am going to add the eyes. So we're going to append new models here. So we're going to go to append and append a sphere. And we're going to use this as our eyes. So I'm going to make sure we do have the sphere selected. And then just scale this down. And then move this out. Okay, so we want this just at the right size. This is also why I've added those eyes in the sculpt, so I can get the right width here, and that looks about right. And then I can move this eye backwards. Keep going. There we go. Move it out just slightly. That looks good. And then I can duplicate this and then move this to the other side. Like so. And if you want to, you can also merge this down. So you can select the top one, merge down, and now they're just one object. So I can go back into my skin head sculpt, and I'm going to go into Damien Standard, and I'm going to make sure it's set to add, or you can just hold Alt on the keyboard to add it. And then I'm going to sculpt around this eye socket, because the eyes aren't going to protrude out that much, so we need to try and sculpt into this. That's looking a bit better. Okay. And if you want, you can also go back into this model, and if you really need to, if you feel like it's not looking perfect, then you could use this move tool and just move this out very slightly. and then go back into your head sculpt and then continue sculpting. Okay, so I think at this stage I'm going to increase the Dynamesh, go back to geometry, and let's bump this up to about 230 and then re-Dynamesh. Let's just do that again, 230. Is it going to do it? Enter, re-Dynamesh, there we go. I'm not sure whether I actually selected or pressed enter before re-Dynameshing. Right, so let's see if we can add a little bit more detail now. A little bit more, yep. Now I'm not going to be concerned with the skin textures just yet, or the skin sculpting, because we're going to do that in the next video. For now I just need to get the exact shape, so then we can move on to that section. So I'm just going to use Damien Standard just to try and push and pull the model, try and get the right shape, and then we can start adding the textures. So here I could add, and then I could use that pinch tool and pinch those lips back in. There we go. Looks pretty good. Right, so I'd say we're getting closer to the end now. We can start applying some more skin surface textures onto our model. I'm just going to go back to that Damien standard and just increase this cut here. Make sure it's set to subtract and cut through this. And then I'll hold Alt to add. There we go. Okay, nearly there. And you know, you can spend hours on this and you can add loads and loads and loads of detail. For now, I'm going to leave it where it is. And then we'll move on to the next video where I'm going to increase the amount of detail and also start adding these skin details as well. So again, take your time with this. Get it to the stage where all of the main areas have been sculpted. So predominantly front of the face. Also make sure that the Dynamesh at this stage is bumped up at least over 200. We'll need to bump this up even more, possibly up to about resolution 300, so we can start adding these skin details, and then we'll divide the mesh as well. Okay, so I will see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.